began to understand the ramifications of what that science teacher had been trying to relate to me. But my fascination with the world of fundamental particles and the world of this interesting guy Feynman, who wrote about it, began that summer morning in high school and in large part has never stopped. I just remembered, as I was writing this, that I chose to write my senior thesis on path integrals, the subject Feynman pioneered. Through a simple twist of fate, I was fortunate enough to meet and spend time with Richard Feynman while I was still an undergraduate. At the time, I was involved with an organization called the Canadian Undergraduate Physics Association, whose sole purpose was to organize a nationwide conference during which distinguished physicists gave lectures and undergraduates presented results from their summer research projects. It was in 1974, I think, that Feynman had been induced, or seduced, I don't know and shouldn't presume, by the very attractive president of the organization to be the keynote speaker at that year's conference in Vancouver. At the meeting, I had the temerity to ask him a question after his lecture, and a photographer from a national magazine took a picture of the moment and used the photo. But more important, I had brought my girlfriend along with me, and one thing led to another, and Feynman spent much of the weekend hanging out with the two of us in some local bars. Later, while I was at graduate school at MIT, I heard Feynman lecture several times. Years later still, after I'd received my PhD and moved to Harvard, I presented a colloquium at Caltech, and Feynman was in the audience, which was slightly unnerving. He politely asked a question or two, and then came up afterward to continue the discussion. I expect he had no memory of our meeting in Vancouver, and I am forever regretful of the fact that I never found out, because while he waited patiently to talk to me, a persistent and rather annoying young assistant professor monopolized the discussion until Feynman finally walked off. I never saw him again, as he died a few years later. Richard Feynman was a legend for a whole generation of physicists long before anyone in the public knew who he was. Getting a Nobel Prize may have put him on the front page of newspapers around the world, but the next day there are new headlines, and any popular name recognition usually lasts about as long as the newspaper itself. Feynman's popular fame thus did not arise from his scientific discoveries, but began through a series of books recounting his personal reminiscences. Feynman, the raconteur, was every bit as creative and fascinating as Feynman the physicist. Anyone who came into personal contact with him had to be struck immediately by his wealth of charisma. His piercing eyes, impish smile, and a New York accent combined to produce the very antithesis of a stereotypical scientist, and his personal fascination with such things as bongo drums and strip bars only added to his mystique. As often happens, however, the real catalyst that made Feynman a public figure arose by accident, in this case a tragic accident, the explosion shortly after liftoff of the Challenger space shuttle, which was carrying the first civilian, a public school teacher, who was scheduled to teach some classes from space. During the investigation that ensued, Feynman was asked to join the NASA investigatory panel, and in an uncharacteristic moment, he studiously avoided committees and anything else that kept him away from his work, he agreed. Feynman pursued the task in his own, equally uncharacteristic way. Rather than study reports and focus on bureaucratic proposals for the future, Feynman talked directly to the engineers and scientists at NASA, and in a famous moment during the televised hearings, he performed an experiment, putting a small rubber O-ring in a glass of ice water and thus demonstrating that the O-rings used to seal the rocket could fail under temperatures as cold as those on the day of the ill-fated launch. Since that day, books chronicling his reminiscences, compilation of his letters, audio tapes of lost lectures, and so on have appeared, and following his death, his legend has continued to grow. Popular Feynman biographies have also been published, with the most notable being Jim Glick's masterful Genius. Feynman the human being will always remain fascinating, but when I was approached about producing a short and accessible volume that might reflect Feynman the man as seen through his scientific contributions, I couldn't resist. The exercise motivated me because I would be reviewing all of his original papers. Most people may not realize that it is rare for scientists to go back to the original literature in their field, especially if the work is more than a generation old. Scientific ideas get distilled and refined, and most modern presentations of the same physics often bear very